Welcome to Inside the Recording Studio. I am Jody Whitesides, and with me is Mr. Chris Hellstrom. How are you today, Chris?
I'm doing very well, Jody.
Well,
how
fantastic.
About yourself?
I'm doing pretty good too. Yes.
Good. Yes. Glad to hear it.
Well, life is good. We should just stop right now. Shortest podcast episode ever. 40 seconds.
Well, I'm not going to top that. So, yeah, everything's good. See you next week, guys.
Yes. All right. Yeah. Well, we should probably actually get on with the actual episode, right?
Let's do it. What are we talking about today?
My impression is we're talking about compression, not impressions, but compressions.
Yeah, that's what we're going to do. We're going to talk a little bit more of an overview of compression because we've done deep dives into some compression units. We've talked about the LA2A, we talked about the 1176, but it dawned on us that we haven't really talked about
compression in and of itself.
Right. So I think we do that because I think that's, it's an important part of the process, and it can be, until we're comfortable with it, it can be a little mysterious and challenging perhaps.
Well, I don't know if it's mysterious, but, actually, maybe it is. It could be. I know that we made gain stage a little less mysterious and phase cancellation a little less mysterious. Maybe we can make compression a little less mysterious. What do you say to that?
I think that sounds like a deal, and we should try to do that right now.
All right. Well, get on it, will you?
I will. Yeah. So I suppose we should talk now. If you're super comfortable about compression and knowing how to do all this kind of stuff, this would probably be a bit of a review for you. But hey, it's good to dust up on our knowledge and brush up on it, or another phrase like that. But we basically have the main, or I'd say the first two controls or parameters that we should think about.
Whoa. Back way up. You're getting right into the controls.
Yeah.
Maybe we should actually talk about what compression does. What exactly is it first?
Oh, fine. I suppose we can do that. Yeah. So compression is obviously something that we do to control dynamics or control peaks in our audio. Where we can, if we have an instrument or something that has a wide dynamic range,
yes,
we can use compression to effectively sort of like turn down the peaks a little bit to make it a little bit more cohesive. You're thinking, I see your
well, my brain just went off because you said it's really more for the peaks, but it also controls the valleys too.
Well, it can, and that's, when we go into it, but I think there's a little bit of a false narrative that you can hear sometimes in that say, okay, well, you're using compression to make things louder.
To make it louder.
Well, that can be a byproduct of how you're using the compression.
Right.
But what we're really effectively doing is that we are, like I said, limiting the dynamic range and effectively turning down peaks. So the byproduct of that is kind of like the low end of the dynamics is coming up. So your whole audio can feel a little bit more cohesive. So it's not so wide. And I think that's why, okay, but now I can turn it up more, or I hear the low parts more. So that's a byproduct of it. But what we're really doing is that we're taming the peaks using compression.
Yes, there is. Yeah, no, I thoroughly well understood exactly what you just said.
Good. All right. So, and I kind of touched on the other little parts in that little spiel there that, we're controlling the dynamics. So if you have, let's say, it could be a percussion part or it could be a vocal part where certain parts, it could be, let's say, a singer, he has to project more at one point. And we can massage that in so it becomes a little bit more even.
Sure. So one of the things in what you were saying is that it can make the softer parts kind of feel a bit louder.
Yeah.
And I think part of that stems from because, part of it arises from the fact that when you're bringing the peaks down, you tend to offset what you've brought down by bringing the overall volume up a little bit. And that's why
you can, yes.
And in that regard, it isn't necessarily that the softer parts are being louder. It is that they are actually louder because you're bringing the volume of everything up in relation.
Exactly. Yeah. So you're squishing down the really loud parts, and thereby you can bring up the whole, and therefore it sounds like the softer parts are getting louder.
Yes.
But effectively, it's the loud parts that are getting softer, but the byproduct is we compensate for that and bring it up.
And we call that dynamic range. Dynamic range of the whole overall thing. Yeah. So we are actually essentially, as you said earlier, reducing the amount of dynamic range.
Yep.
So, which is really kind of weird when you think about it.
Why is that?
Well, in the days of recording on tape, they did it for a very specific reason, and it had more to do with the fact that the noise floor of tape was rather high in relation to digital. Or at least it's rather high in relation to today's digital. I won't say that it was rather high in relation to the early days of digital. But the idea of the noise floor was the whole reason for squishing down the peaks so they wouldn't distort on the tape, and then you could bring the overall volume of everything up to be above the quote-unquote noise floor of the tape, so it was easier to hear. Now, with the dynamic range of digital, why we're actually doing this is almost kind of, it seems, in a sense, more of an effect these days than it is a reality of like, well, I need it to be above the noise floor. Well, technically, there really isn't much of a noise floor. So,
I suppose you can think of it that way. I mean, I think it's still, when I use compression, I, very rarely think about, I got to watch the noise floor because of the medium. No,
that's
that
what I'm saying.
It, right?
We don't have that issue anymore that we have to worry about a noise floor.
But it's also, we touched on this when we talked about the gain staging in the gain staging episode. We talked about gain staging and where that comes from. But for me, it's there are other byproducts of coming from compressing a signal, and of course, we're like you said, we're reducing the dynamic range. But an effect from that is not just bringing up what's perceived as lower level dynamics in the signal, but it's also, it can add energy because you're hearing everything. It sounds like a little bit more in your face, and you can make it sound a little bit more exciting with that. There's also bad parts of that because it's very, very easy to overdo compression, right? Because you see, compression sounds really, really good. So more has to be better, right? Because as we all know, more is more.
More is always better, right? No, but
not always. Yeah. Because, I think we touched on this when we talked about the 1176s and the LA2As, but you can wonder where all the emotion went.
Sure.
It's like, well, what happened? Because it's just squished as a pancake now, and it's just, there's no life left in the signal. So
hey, pancakes are good stuff sometimes, man. Don't knock pancakes.
Just not in audio, right?
Well, right. You don't want to pancake your audio, or at least most of the time. Yeah. Generally, you don't want to pancake your audio. So
that sounds like a slogan that should go on a t-shirt. Don't pancake your audio.
Okay, we've got our first ITRS t-shirt that we're going to be putting on sale. Don't pancake your audio.
There you go.
Join the email list and sign up and buy one. We'll have them in a few weeks' time. All right. So
don't pancake your audio, man.
Oh, okay.
I'm sorry. Let's get back on track.
Yeah, let's do. All right. So let's kicking it off now that we've kind of given the whole impression of like what was the theory behind using compression and what we're doing with it, sonically speaking. Let's maybe dive into some of the controls of how compression actually starts to work, right?
Yeah.
Sure.
So I think that the two big ones to start with there is the threshold and the ratio.
Oh, well, why don't we take a step back and just talk about the first one? There's a lot to unpack right there.
There's a lot there because threshold is at what level does the compression start to kick in?
What volume level that it's coming in on your input?
Correct.
Yes.
Yeah, into the compressor, right? So at what level will that start to activate, right? So you fine tune that ideally so that you're just hitting those peaks that you wanted to catch.
And ideally, what were those peaks supposed to be?
Well,
that's all relative.
That's just, yeah, that's all relative. And this is one of those things where it drives me crazy when you see like presets on a compressor, because all of this is content dependent, as we like to say. Right?
Sure.
So it's like, well, yeah, this might have worked for whatever you're dialing this up at, but it doesn't mean that it's going to work in your case. So we have to listen for that, and that just listen for your ear. And we can use the VU meters or whatever digital meters that we have on that to see that we're catching some compression and we're taking off as much as we kind of want.
Sure. You know what? You're kind of like throwing a whole lot of stuff out there that isn't really a layman's kind of thing. So,
okay.
First off, what's a VU meter? We've never actually discussed that. And since you've just mentioned it kind of rather prominently here, what exactly is a VU meter?
Well, VU meter is, a meter. It's kind of what we think about that needle that we kind of look at that goes up and down in accordance to our audio,
or back
for the
and
signal
forth,
that's coming in, or back and forth if we're viewing gain reduction.
Sure.
Right. So it would go up and we would see it kind of kicking back down. So it's when we look at that sort of old school meter where it has a needle moving in both directions. That's a VU meter.
Right. Okay. Just checking.
Making
sure that you know what you're talking about and everybody else knows what we're talking about.
Oh, dude, I'm winging this as we're going along. I've never used a compressor at all. Yeah. So the next thing that is the ratio. And the ratio
hold
is...
on. Let's back up for a second on this threshold thing, because you started to talk about the fact that you're not real keen on a lot of the presets that come in, and we never really discussed why you want to set the threshold, because you mentioned, well, you want to kind of take off the peaks. What exactly does that mean? Because we need to think about, what is the volume level that's entering the darn thing, right? No matter what compressor it is. So the reason why we're setting a threshold is to understand, well, where is our volume level in relation to what this input is that's coming into the compressor? And that threshold usually has a dial of, I don't know, -20 to, depending on, and when it says -20, that means
up to unity usually.
Up to unity or whatever. The -20 is in relation to -20 dB. And maybe it goes a little further, maybe on either side of whether it goes lower in the spectrum of volume or higher in the spectrum of volume. But the threshold actually means what point, as you said, the compressor is going to start kicking in and affecting the signal based on what volume level the threshold is set at. So if you have like a baseline, let's say, coming in and you've recorded it at, as I like to say, a -18 peaking situation on your DAW, and you set the threshold to be at, say, -20, that means that anytime the signal actually starts going above -20, it's going to start affecting the signal.
Yeah, it's starting to apply compression at that point.
Right, -20 dB at that point. So if most of your baseline is playing below -20, most of your baseline is never going to get affected by the actual compression ratio, which we're about to talk about. But anything that does rise above, if you say set it at -18 and you're peaking slightly above -18, then anything above -18 is going to be affected. Now, if you're recording much hotter levels and say your bass is coming in a relative level of say -15, but your peaks are hitting at say -10, which are pretty extravagant peaks, and you set your threshold for say -12, well, anything that starts hitting above -12 in your signal path will start being affected by the compressor. So that's a big discussion on setting your threshold. It has everything to do with how loud you've actually recorded that track, what your gain was coming into it before. Now we're going to get on and move on with the ratio.
Right. But that's also assuming that the compressor is the first thing in your chain.
Yeah. Well, yeah.
Right. So
anything that's coming to the compressor at that level. Yeah.
Right. So if you just have a pure unadulterated signal that's like you said, that's peaking at -18.
Yes.
then that's absolutely true. But if you have something else that's going on before you're hitting the compressor, so we want to make sure, I think, that we specify that it is the signal going into the compressor. So whatever is happening before that, then that's how we set the threshold. But it's also, we can do this sort of scientifically by numbers, like you said, where I want to make sure I'm not hitting too high, right? Or I'm not hitting too hot.
Correct.
But it's one of those phrases that you don't want to necessarily hear when you're learning to do something, but you have to use your ear to, just like determine what it is that we're doing, right? And it all depends on if we're looking at a high ratio. We'll get to that in a second. A high ratio where it's almost like a limiting situation where we absolutely don't want anything to get through, or we're just massaging those levels. So all of this kind of goes hand in hand, as we'll discover here.
Yes, they do work in conjunction, but I just wanted to really bear down on the threshold thing because it does make a massive difference on how the compressor will react.
Absolutely. So should you talk about ratio or should I go into it?
Well, I can certainly talk about ratio.
Go for it. Why don't you kick off ratio here? Yeah.
Okay, I'll kick it off and then you clean it up.
I'll take a little bit of a coffee here. Yeah.
Okay. So ratio is the knob that tells the compressor how much it's should start compressing, and that's easier to say than do.
It's easier to do than to say, actually. Yeah.
Well, either way you want to look at it. The ratio is how much you're going to start compressing the signal once it crosses the threshold. So a ratio of 1-to-1 means you're not doing any compression at all because whatever's coming in at 1 dB of volume is going out at 1 dB of volume. If you set it at, say, 2-to-1 and something crosses the threshold that you have set, the volume that's now going to come out is half as loud. So if it goes over your threshold by 2 dB, it's coming out of the compressor at 1 dB. And so on and so forth. If you go up to, say, 4-to-1 ratio on your compressor, if it goes in at 4 dB over the threshold, what comes out is 1 dB. At that volume level. Does that make sense, Chris?
Yes.
Okay.
It does make, well, it makes sense to me because I know how it works.
But that's how it works.
But yeah, absolutely. But that's really what happens, right? So, and one thing that I used to make the mistake of, I was thinking that, well, 4-to-1, that's not a whole lot of compression. I want it to be 8-to-1 or whatever. But when you really step back,
that shit.
Yeah. But when you really step back and look at like a 4-to-1 ratio,
it's a pretty hefty difference.
Ratio. Yeah, it's a pretty hefty difference, right? So
because as you know, just to kind of take a sidestep for one moment, your channel strip volume levels, if you go up 1 dB, so to speak, is it something like it's considered to be perceptively twice as loud? Is that correct? How many dB is it? It's a very small amount in volume level that is considered to be perceivably different in how loud something comes out. So,
well, I think that's are you talking about? Is that the sort of Fletcher Munson thing that you're talking about? Yeah, I think it's highly dependent on frequency. So certain frequencies we detect a lot easier or we're more sensitive to than others. So,
but the amount of volume that when you change like the dB amount, it doesn't seem like it would be a lot to suddenly strike a huge difference in what's going on. And my point to that is when you're saying, well, 4-to-1 isn't much, but 8-to-1 is where I want to be. That's a substantial amount of gain change when you think about it. And it can reduce the amount of volume that you're hearing drastically, and it can make a sound wildly different.
Right. And sometimes that's appropriate, right? When you have certain things, so it's just really, really loud in certain spots, perhaps. But
program dependent.
Yeah, absolutely. But if you think about that too, it's like, so let's say that we have, an 8-to-1 ratio, right?
Which
now,
is
if we go
hefty.
over, that's pretty hefty. But now, once you get over the threshold, to be able to go over that by 2 dB, it's just going to go up 2 dB. You have to actually feed it like 16 dB above the threshold. Right?
Above the threshold, it's got to be a lot.
Yeah, so it squishes, and then as we talked about in the deep dives of the LA2A and the 1176, how each compressor, how quickly it deals with those maximum ratios there, it depends. So that's where we can get into different flavors of compressor kind of thing.
Sure.
But overall, that's how ratios work, right?
Yes. And it's always going to be a lot less than you think it is.
Yeah. Yeah. And what's the... I think, I'm not sure if there's a general consensus, but is it like 30-1 that's considered like limiting? And I know some people say,
I would think it's less than that. I think 20,
maybe 20
to 1 is where you're starting to get into limiting rather than compressing, really.
Right. Because that's
anything up to, I think personally, anything past 5 is quite heavy handed, but that's just me.
Yeah.
So.
Well, but again, it depends on what we're doing. And of course, if you have, let's say that you just really need to tame a couple of quick peaks somewhere, maybe a higher threshold, but with a higher ratio is
all it's needed.
Day,
yeah,
right?
It really just kind of depends. Yes.
What we're trying to do. Yep. Okay. So we've now talked about how we're effectively turning down peaks. Right. And that's kind of what we're controlling with all this kind of stuff. So
before we get into the next section of what we're about to speak of, let's have a word from our sponsor.
Let's do it.
All right. We're talking about makeup gain at this point.
We are.
Because
we're
making stuff up.
Yeah. Well, but we are, we've turned down peak levels.
Right.
Using our ratio and set it with the threshold. So the overall signal gets softer or not as strong. So we can compensate for that with the makeup gain. So we don't necessarily just use volume. And now if we use that makeup gain, say that we're taking off 5 dB, let's say, we could now effectively turn up 5 dB and we'd have the same overall loudness, but we're now hearing everything, or the lower, softer signals in our track as well.
Yeah, we'll come up that amount. But is it? See, now my impression would be if you're doing a 5-1, you're bringing down 5 dB for everything that goes up over the threshold 5 dB, but it's coming out 1 dB. Yeah, okay, never mind. Brain fart.
Yeah,
forget what I'm saying.
A lot of this, it's okay, but because it's so much easier when you can. Again, we're talking about sound here, so it's kind of hard. But when you hear it in front of you, you know that you can turn it back. Everything is dependent on your ear. You just want to do that. So, but that's what makeup gain does. So if you're taking off a lot, you're shaving off a lot, you can compensate with the makeup gain. So this is at the end of the signal going through your compressor.
Coming back out the back end.
Exactly. Yeah. And sometimes...
Now, why did we stick the output in the middle? Because we've got 2 more things to think of.
We do. Well, because I think it makes... If you have an understanding of what those 3 do...
Yes.
I think the next 2 here becomes a little bit more of the fine-tuning of how we're dealing with everything that we have there. And we're, of course, talking about the attack time and the release time.
Gotcha.
So let's start with the release time. No.
Let's go real backwards.
Yeah. Now, with this is there's a lot of, we've said in many podcasts that you and I are pretty big on definitions.
Sure.
Of what things actually mean.
Because definitions help define shit.
Yeah, and it makes it easier.
If you don't know the definition, you can't define it. How can you know how to handle it appropriately? Yeah. That's why.
So, right. So hopefully we can clear up some possible misconceptions that are out there. We'll try anyway. We'll do our best, and then people will tell us, "Oh, you're full of shit." But
yes.
I don't think I am at this point with the information I sit on.
So is that a CRD?
CRD?
Yeah, Chris, reality distortion.
Maybe I'm just like, Steve Jobs. I got my own like reality field. I reject your reality and substitute my own.
Right. All right. So let's get back to the attack because I was attacking you.
Yeah. So attack time. So what the attack time is how long it takes for the compressor to reach maximum compression once it hits the threshold.
Right. Can you say that one more time just because it's like we're throwing a lot of information at people right now? So say that again.
Okay. The amount of time it takes the compressor to reach maximum compression once the signal passes the threshold.
Right.
So
does that make sense to everyone? I certainly hope so.
Well, I see a couple of hands. Yeah, so hopefully that makes sense. But because it's not like, it's going to bypass a threshold. No, the threshold is already there. As soon as it sees the threshold, it starts acting.
Yes.
But it's how long it takes for it to reach maximum compression.
Correct.
So this is something that we usually measure in milliseconds.
Really quick shit.
Yeah, or sometimes even up to a second. But again, this is very much content dependent and dependent on what it is that you're trying to do to your signal.
And as we have noted in a couple of the deep dives, one of the deep dives had an attack time knob.
Uh-huh.
One of them did not because it was just inherently built into the unit in the type of compression that it is. So not all compressors will have an attack knob.
Yeah.
Just so you know.
One of them.
Yes.
Yeah, it's just a set. It's like, yep, this is how it works. Send it into it. But but attack time is something that can be this is understatement of the year, but very, very helpful to know how to work, right? Because it affects a lot. And personally, it took me a while to understand what the attack and release actually did, and you just kind of turning it blindly, but learning what to listen for is a
big deal.
Imperative.
It's a big deal. Just kidding.
And a good trick, and this is something that we can actually do on on the Tuesday tip coming up for this episode. But
okay,
if you have a compression set, you've set your threshold and you've set your ratio, and then excuse me, you start by having a really, really long attack time.
Right. And this is instrument dependent at this point.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's probably good to try this on something that is relatively percussive so that you have a lot of peaks and things to go. Not
in
just
other words, like congas, bongos, triangles, drum sets.
that kind of thing, right? Or even like a strumming
guitar,
acoustic guitar, perhaps.
Right? A funk pattern.
Yeah. Right.
Bounce, bow, bow.
There you go. And then to slowly make the attack time shorter. And you will hear when you're starting to really, really affect the signal with a compressor. And if you go too far, so you have a really, really short attack time, you can potentially you hear when you start squeezing the life out of the signal. And that's, probably a good signal to for you to ease off a little bit on the attack time. So I think that's a great way to, learn how to adjust that and learn how to listen for it. Because, I think with a lot of this stuff, it's not like people don't hear what they're doing, but a lot of times we don't know what to listen for.
Yes.
So if you listen to that bite at the beginning of the attack time or the compression, it is a good thing to do.
People say. Sorry. All right. A little bit of spinal tap moment. All right. Let's move on from the attack time now that you have so appropriately discussed how it works and talk about the release time. And I'll just kind of jump in on this first. So release time works in conjunction with the attack time, the makeup gain, the ratio, and the threshold. More or less is how long the compressor will hold on to the compression setting that it has had until the signal goes back below the threshold. So what that means is that you could have this sound that gets clamped down by the compressor. And if you set for a really long release time, the sound could be kind of technically, quote unquote, well below the threshold before the compressor will let it go, which gives the appearance of more volume for a longer period of time. Right?
Yeah.
In a sense.
So, in a sense, what I would like to add there is this is where some, again, confusion with release time and definitions and that sort of thing, because it gets kind of fuzzy.
Yes, it does.
But it's once it hits maximum compression through the attack time, the release time, the release will start to happen right away, but the release time will determine how long it takes for that to go down to the threshold again.
Right.
So,
well, but not down to the threshold, because technically speaking, if it's still above the threshold, it's still compressing.
Yes. Yeah. So let's say, for example, if you just have a snare hit, let's say, just a single snare hit, it's how long it takes for that to die down, how gradually, if you will, that release will happen.
Right.
And this is another one that's important, because if you have too long of a release time, you're messing up for the next hit on the compression, right? You're essentially squishing the life out of stuff.
Yes. So if it's still trying to release before the next hit happens, you're not going to get the same attack value as the first hit that didn't have a release going on during its attack, is what you're trying to say.
Yes. So again, here at the other end of the spectrum, if we have too short of a release time, and too short, again, this is just by taste, right? Depends on what it is that you're trying to do. You can get an artifact known as pumping. Right?
Yes.
You can hear very, very gradually how, or drastically how the compression is working, and it can sound unnatural. Now, in certain music styles, this is sometimes beneficial.
Desirable.
Like if we're, when we hear that pumping and the EDM and that kind of stuff, we have that sort of sucking of the backing track, that kind of thing. Sounds just
very
like
rhythmic,
that.
Yes.
Yeah.
Slurp, slurp.
So again, with the release time here, similar method could be good just to listen for that, where we start with either a really short or really long release time and just start backing that off on those signals, and we hear it. We can set those. I mean, I think this is something that you've talked about, that you have done when you like to set your release time in time with the music.
Yes.
If it's at all possible, like for snare hits and that kind of thing.
Yes, I do kind of do that from time to time.
Yeah. So it's something that we can use, because if we have a longer release time on, let's say we've talked about percussive things here, like the snare drum, we give the impression of that the snare is as a fuller body for longer, as opposed to just being this it beat, it kind of ring out.
If you over compress a snare, it can start coming out sounding like as you just mentioned.
Yeah. But what is that? You like to say throwing tic tacs out a window or something?
Tic tacs at a window. There's a couple of different terms I like to use. There's the throwing tic tacs at a window, and there's also the ping pong balls slapping off water.
There you go. So that's how compression works, Jody.
Yes, I feel like we've kind of given a pretty darn good overview, don't you? I don't know. I guess we'll have people tell us.
If you have any questions, people just email us or comment on social media or anything that you have any questions. Don't be shy. Just shoot out the questions, and we'll do our best to answer them.
But of course, so that means it's now time for Friday Finds. Chris, what do you got of us?
I have a bass amp emulator. I've often sung the praises that I really like the ones in Logic, and I still do. But I tried out a new plugin from Nembrini Audio.
Nembrini.
And it's called Black Ice Beta Gamma. And
this sounds like dangerous driving in winter weather.
Yeah, this is a deep plugin.
Deep.
It's deep. It's deep, which is suitable for a bass, I suppose.
Especially for the name of it too. I mean, the company Nambrini. It just sounds so futuristic.
Yeah, well, Nambrini is the name of the guy, actually.
Well,
Igor Nambrini, I think.
Lucky him. He's got a futuristic name for a plugin.
Hell yeah. But it's based off of an actual box.
Which box is it based on?
I think it's actually called the Black Ice.
Okay.
Yeah. But it is, I really like it. I might actually buy this one, as opposed to just trying it out here. But it's got the usual suspects. You know, you can pick your cabs. You can pick a couple of microphones, placements, that type of thing.
Yes.
You can load your own IRs into it. There's a DI box. You can blend everything. There's EQs. There's lots of distortion that you can put into this. And it's a pretty deep plugin. I like it. I've only messed around with it for a little bit, but so far I'm impressed. So Black Ice, Beta Gamma from Nambrini.
Black Ice. All right. Well,
yeah.
Mine's not as cool.
What do you got?
You know, it's funny that you mention a bass amp because I got a free bass amp this week. And I'm talking, yeah, it's not a Nambrini, unfortunately. It's not as futuristically cool sounding, and it's not Black Ice or Ice Black. Or, mine is an Ampeg bass amp emulation, and it comes from the fine folks over at PA Plugin Alliance. They actually gave away an Ampeg bass amp this week. So I was like, I'm going to snatch, even though I have plenty of plug-in amps for all kinds of things. It's like, hey, you can always use one more Ampeg type amp, can't you?
Because more is always more.
More is always more, exactly.
Yeah, no, it's cool. No, I tried that one out as well. I like it. It's obviously scaled down of their but it's very, very passable. It has two different chains.
Yes.
Cabinet chains, as well as you can bypass it and use your own IR loader.
Okay, well,
you've been known to do.
I've always been known to do. Yes.
Yeah.
I'm still a big proponent of that. In fact, I started going off on the deep end of exploring more complicated guitar and bass setups this past week in my preset lists, as you are wont to know that I am to do. But the idea here is that Plugin Alliance was doing a nice giveaway of their Ampeg bass amp emulation, and I snatched it because I could, and because, I like Ampeg bass amps because they sound great. So that is my Friday find. And so let's see, I'm going to reiterate the fact that you had mentioned we're going to do the Tuesday tip this week on setting compression. And I would assume that you're going to work that with drums, right? Yes, no, maybe? Sure. Okay.
Yep. Yeah, let's do that. Yep.
Drum compression. So that way people can hopefully hear what you're talking about when you talk about the attack time, the release time, my threshold, my ratio, and my makeup gain. So yeah, there's all kinds of things to think about. And I don't know what compressor you're planning on using, but I'm sure it will be lovely. Maybe you should do more than one to kind of give a reference to a couple of different types of compression sounds.
Well, initially I was thinking of just using the standard Logic one because it has very similar controls as to any other compressor you might have. So you can really demonstrate that without it being, this sounds like a LA2A or sounds like whatever. So I think I'll do something more generic.
Generic. All right. Sounds good. So you can work with this stuff straight out of your DAW, because why wouldn't you if you have the tools necessary right at your fingertips? And while we've got your attention, please go to our website and leave us a review via insidetherecordingstudio.com/review, or you can just go to insidetherecordingstudio.com and poke around. In addition to that, you can sign up for our email list, at which you'll get some free plugin presets from Mr. Chris Hellstrom for your favorite Slate plugins, or at least his favorite Slate plugins. And you'll get several presets of my favorite presets on Universal Audio plugins that I tend to like to use quite a bit. In addition to that, if I haven't already just said it, you can sign up for the email list. Oh, I was just describing why you'd want to sign up for the email list. All right. My brain's working faster than my head. All right. in addition to that,
That's okay.
once you sign up for the email list, you will get weekly reminders of the shows and Tuesday tips that have just happened. And you won't miss out on any future episodes of the podcast, because why would you want to do that? It's such a fantastic podcast. In fact, it's so fantastic, I bet you're telling 2 friends, and they'll tell 2 friends, and they'll tell 2 friends. Or if we want to go more like the pay it forward kind of thing, you tell 3 friends, and then they tell 3 friends, and then it just really mushrooms like unbelievable. So yes. And
We would appreciate it.
yeah, we certainly would. In addition to that, if you have made it this far and you would like to send an email to Goldstar, GOLDSTAR, at InsideTheRecordingStudio.com with the word compression, you might just get something fun back in your email box. I'm just saying. And in addition to that, if you have a topic of suggestion or a suggested topic for discussion for Chris and I to pontificate upon or explain in greater detail, contact us via the contact page at InsideTheRecordingStudio.com, and we will put it into rotation for consideration, provided it's music recording related. I mean, if you ask us to talk about why you shouldn't stare at the sun unless you have very powerful sunglasses on, we may not have anything to say about that. So with that,
I could probably answer that, but with that, Jody, let's put a bow on it.
all right, I'm wrapping it up and saying, see ya.
See you, Jody. Have a good one.